I want to begin this video by talking in general terms about the three piano trios that comprise Beethoven's Opus 1, sharing a few thoughts on what their published order tells us about the composer and how I think he wanted his public to understand them. This is something I've never seen or heard discussed, and you are free to chalk it up as wild conjecture, but hear me out. As I've already indicated in the two videos preceding this one, the first trio in E-flat major sounds a lot like Beethoven's great predecessor Joseph Haydn, with whom the younger composer had a few composition lessons. That work does include passages that Haydn would not likely have written, in fact possibly could not have imagined, such as the entire scherzo movement and a remarkable voyage into E major during the final movement's coda. Overall, however, it's quite easy to discern the spirit of Haydn hovering over the whole. The second of the set, the G major trio that I examined a few days ago, seems more like the music of Mozart, with whom Beethoven had actually aimed to study, but whose life was unfortunately cut short before Beethoven could relocate to Vienna. In the second trio, the overall content is more lyrical, the phrases and periods less balanced, and the mood somewhat more inner-directed. These things can often be said of Mozart's music. In the third of the trios, the one we're examining today, it is a new voice we hear, especially in the first movement, the voice of Beethoven, barely awakened but unmistakable. The choice of key is not surprising. Much of Beethoven's most original and definitive work is in this dark key. Compare, if you like, his Fourth String Quartet, Third Piano Concerto, and Fifth Symphony, all set in C minor. In the present trio, the convention of clearly demarked endings of transition and exposition is starting to evaporate, and a sense of inevitable succession from moment to moment begins to assert itself. Many analysts have commented on this dimension of Beethoven's music, and it is certainly in evidence here. But there's another aspect of Opus 1 that strikes me as even more Beethovenian, and that is the choice of keys and their order of presentation. Trio 1 is in E-flat major, Trio 2 in G major, and Trio 3 C minor. That is a strong tonal progression from another important key for Beethoven, E-flat major. Compare the 10th and 12th string quartets, the Emperor Concerto, and the Eroica Symphony with its C minor funeral march. Through the mediant related key of G major for Trio 2, to the resolution of that key as dominant preparation into C minor, the first trio's relative key. If this seems like clutching at straws, I invite you to compare the order of Beethoven's first 6 string quartets, published 6 years later as Opus 18. Those quartets were not published in the same order of their composition, which must mean that Beethoven did some serious thinking about the published order in which they should appear. Here's the key trajectory through those 6 quartets: F major, G major, D major, C minor, A major, B flat major. If you omit the C minor quartet, you'll see a very strong rising progression, taking us through a series of keys that explores progressively bright dimensions of the circle of fifths, with the penultimate quartet couched in the leading tone of the final work of the set, which incidentally resolves the first quartet of the set as dominant to tonic. The C minor intrusion into that progression is striking, and certainly an ear-catching way of beginning the second half of the set and offering a sort of alternative. These choices cannot be arbitrary or accidental. Give that some thought, and let me know what you think. In this recording, we'll again hear violinist Itzhak Perlman, cellist Lynn Harrell, and pianist Vladimir Ashkenazy, in a release by EMI Classics. It is in Movement 1 that we encounter the first stirrings of new compositional blood. If you were to compare this music to the third of Haydn's London symphonies and the 22nd of Mozart's piano concertos, both in the same key, I believe it will be obvious that Beethoven has taken his cue from the latter. In this work, we hear the same kinds of unbalanced musical periods, the same kind of inconclusion in some of his themes, and a sustained seriousness that is missing from the Haydn work I cited. And the voice is distinctive. The details of construction that we'll encounter on the way through this movement are quite original. The movement is constructed as a sonata form essay with repeated exposition. Unfortunately, our musicians have elected to ignore that directive, so listen carefully and absorb as many of the details as you can on your one and only hearing. There is one thing in particular that you'll want to notice. The second member of the second group and the exposition's closing are based on the themes that I have identified as 1A and 1B. That's not quite enough for this movement to qualify as monothematic, but it comes very close. And theme 1B, which has already been revisited during the exposition's closing, receives such a thorough treatment during the development that the composer saw fit to omit it during the recapitulation. The result is striking. I'll let you discover that for yourself. As Beethoven matured, he became increasingly interested in the possibilities afforded by variations form, and some of his finest, most innovative compositions are couched in it. This early set, however, is well behaved, 18th century music for sure. The movement is set in the relative key, which has already been explored during the second group of the first movement. Its character is gracious and genial. Its thema, a theme for varying, is constructed as a tidy double period in gavotte rhythm, which is to say that its phrasing runs from midbar to midbar, and its antecedent and consequent phrases are stated twice. Initially, that's to accommodate a change in orchestration for the restatements, so those restatements are written out. During the variations themselves, the restatements are literal and thus indicated by the standard repeat signs, usually accompanied by first and second endings. In case this terminology is unfamiliar, I want to digress briefly with an explanation. A musical period is a compound musical structure consisting of at least two phrases in an antecedent-consequent relationship, which is to say that the first of the phrases ends in a non-final way, and its answering phrase brings the music to its close on the tonic. In major key music, this movement providing an example, the most important secondary key is usually the dominant, which means that the antecedent phrase will end on that chord, B flat major in the present case. In minor key music, the most important secondary key is usually the mediant or relative major, which is why we encounter so much E flat major music in this composition, and also the reason why you will occasionally see me adopt a shorthand to indicate tonal direction. 1 to 5 in this movement, 1 to 3 in the minuet that follows. There are 5 variations in this movement, with the 4th couched in the parallel minor. All of the variations follow the same formal and harmonic rubrics, and a very tidy coda lays the movement to rest quietly. In the minuet movement, we return to the key of the opening movement, if not exactly its spirit. If you keep in mind what I said about periodic construction, you'll be able to see that a two-part dance movement, such as the one now under review, follows exactly the same design, but in a much more worked-out way. That is, the first strain is antecedent in quality, and the second strain answers that inconclusive strain with music that returns to the tonic. This is like both a great expansion of the musical period and a considerable reduction of sonata form. The trio is set in the parallel major, a truly striking contrast, brimming with goodwill and optimism, and begins with a cascade of semiquavers revisited several times. The da capo reprise is completely regular, and the movement ends quietly, like movement 2, a pattern that we've also seen in the first two works in this set. final movement recaptures the spirit of Movement 1, informed by the vigor we usually associate with such movements. The exposition repeat is thankfully, in this case, honored. The construction of Theme 1 is actually quite close to that of the opening movement's first theme, and the movement's overall harmonic scheme is also similar. The development section deals almost exclusively with Theme 2, and the recapitulation omits the opening flourish that begins both the movement and its development section. The most remarkable innovation happens during the coda, when Beethoven follows exactly the opposite procedure from the one he observed in the first of this triptych of compositions. In the E-flat major trio, the composer paid a surprise visit to the bright, remote key of E major. Here, he permits the music to sink a half step into B minor before ratcheting it back up to the tonic key in a delicious formal counterpoint that can only be appreciated if the first work in this set is held in mind. And unlike the first two compositions in this very impressive early publication, Trio number 3 ends quietly, bringing the entire set to a gracious conclusion in C major.